Thank you very much. So I've called this special educational needs inclusive design, inclusive learning design for the few can also benefit the many, because as Nancy was saying, it's you're not just designing for one very small group of people when you're designing for the few. Because what I want to try and show is that whatever you introduce for them can also benefit almost everybody else as well. And of course, inclusivity takes many different types of form, depends on the nature of the special needs that a particular group has. So I'm going to go through three different examples of the ways in which this can help. The contrasting examples of how you get value for the many when you design for the few. So you're focusing on a particular group, might be quite a small group, but the changes you make for them and the ideas and innovations that you develop for them can also be, well, as the quote says, what most people call a feature, and it benefits them as well. And what I want to try and do in the process of doing this is derive the general learning design principles that we might frame from this, and therefore deriving the general learning design methodology from that. Okay, so why do we design for the few? Well, if we focus on the needs of the many, then we must also adapt to the needs of the few, and that's very costly because there are many different kinds of groups, and that makes life much more difficult in the end. If we begin with the needs of a specific diversity group, this output is often of value to the many. But the challenges that are presented by the needs of the few often trigger more innovative ideas and solutions, and these can also be of value to the many. Some people call this the curb ramp effect. And this is a little quote from a woman who was a campaigner back in the day for the curb ramp, which was built for people with wheelchairs. And as she says, it's not for the hard commuter, it wasn't for the parent with a stroller, it wasn't for the traveler dragging a suitcase home. It was built so one group could simply move through the city with dignity. But then something happened. Parents started using it, travelers rode their luggage, delivery workers used it, kids on cycles and skates glided across it. It was designed for some, but it was better for all. And that notion of the curb ramp effect is what's behind a lot of this kind of analysis. So the examples of inclusive design benefits, I'm going to consider these three contrasting cases, all of which have happened and are relevant to different aspects and contexts of education, and education really at all levels. I'm not really talking about universities, particularly this would happen for schools all the way through to professional education. So in many ways, these would all be relevant, I think, no matter what your context. Audio versions of study texts for blind students go back a very long way, and I'll discuss some of the history of that. Maths games for people who are dyscalculic, and as Nancy mentioned, this is the area that I've done some work in myself. So I'll explain what dyscalculia is and then how we tackled it. And then online asynchronous communication. Now, we do an awful lot of that, a fantastic amount, but the extent to which this is inclusive varies, and in some ways it can be especially of value to people in different kinds of disability groups. So audio versions of study texts for blind students, the audiobooks originated 100 years ago for people who were blind. They were recorded, as you can see here, on very old-fashioned discs, LPs, and so on. And then once they became of value to blind people, when I was at the Open University, which had 100 to 200,000 students all over the country and in other parts of the world, there was something like 800 students who were studying in this online. It wasn't online in those days. It was an open university where people would have study texts sent to them, and they would go to local groups, study groups, once a month to work with a tutor. But otherwise, it was mainly working through study texts and the occasional television program. And so we had something like 800 Open University students who were blind. And the staff at the Open University would take it in turns to record readings of the texts on their courses. So we all contributed to creating these audio versions of texts for the blind students. And this was, of course, the only university in the whole UK where blind students could study alongside everybody else and in exactly the same way. And there were no lectures or anything like that. It was all working through texts. By now, of course, the audiobook has become commonplace for all of us, and the revenue generated by UK publishers is a nice example of how this has happened. It rose by 31% between 2023 and 24, with income from audiobooks reaching a record 268 million last year. And as many of us have found, it's a delightful way to read a book. So again, this is a very nice example, I think, of a technology that was created for the few, but in benefits so many, millions of other people as well. Now we come to maths games for people who are dyscalculic. Now, dyscalculia is a developmental brain disorder. Tests show that people who have dyscalculia have no sense of number. They think they don't understand that numbers are made up of other numbers. And if you ask them to compare the numerosity, how many, which of these two displays of dots is the larger, for example, the only way they can tell you that is by counting each one and seeing which has the larger number. Now, this has been shown through neuroscience to be a disorder in this part of the brain, the intraparietal sulcus. And all that happens is that it interferes with the way in which you process these kinds of objects in the world. Got nothing at all to do with intelligence. You can have people who are dyscalculic who run large companies, for example. They just get other people to do the arithmetic for them now and again. So it's, and you may well, given the prevalence, 5 to 6% in most of the countries where it's been tested, means that it's quite likely that during your lifetime, and probably even now, you will come across someone who has dyscalculia. You won't notice it because you can't tell in normal interactions that this is an issue. But if you ever noticed that when they go into a shop and they buy something and they don't know how much change to expect, they will pay for a tube of toothpaste with a £20 note. I've forgotten the currency, Hong Kong dollars. They will pay thousands of Hong Kong dollars across for because they don't know how much it is. They don't know how to compare. It's that sort of thing. So it's not noticeable in normal life except for those people who have to be very, very careful about how they do arithmetic because it does not come naturally to them. So our question has to be, how can educational help such learners? And it can be at any age. You don't get rid of it as you get older. So whatever you're creating for students in primary school should be of value to older people as well, because they will also need it. So what we set out to do in this kind of learning design is to create a constructionist micro world where sets of numbers behave according to their numerosity, and the learner's task is to construct a target set, and I'll show you what that means. This is a game called Number Beads. It's built by constructionist design, which means the key concept of construction is you act on a world and you get meaningful feedback on what you made in that world. And essentially, that's what Papert was talking about, Seymour Papert, who invented Logo back in the day. He was talking about that. And it describes very well the way in which we learn about the world from day one as babies. We try to grab something and wave our arms around and it doesn't quite hit. And then suddenly it hits. And then you try to think, what did I do there? And how do I do that again? It's just learning by having a goal in the world and you make some kind of action and you get meaningful feedback on your action, which tells you what you made. So this is a target is to make a set of 4, and you've got all these different sets of numbers here. And what you can do is split them or pull them together. So here I'm splitting this one, and I've made that into 2 separate ones. Now, it doesn't say, well, you haven't made a 4, that's not correct. It just tells you what you've made. That's all it does, and that's fine. because then you can mess around with that. You can try and pull one of these down to join the other one, or you can experiment with doing something else. If you pull a 2 to a 2, then it'll make a 4. And now you see how you've made the 4. It doesn't tell you you're right. You can just see that this is what you made. And so now that moves into part of your score. So that's what I mean by constructionist. You're getting meaningful feedback from the environment that enables you to correct your action and get closer to your goal. And then as you move through the program, you gradually are scaffolded through seeing how different digits relate to these different numbers of beads. And then we take away the color. So you've just got to be aware of the numerosity and the number. And then we take away the beads, and now you've got to try and work with just the digits. So that's how they get through to the point of now being able to work with arithmetic in the classroom and being able to do something which up until that time they'd found very problematic because numbers don't make any sense to them. And for those of us who understand what numbers are, the best way I can give you a sense of what it's like is if I asked you what's the relationship between K and P, you say, what are you talking about? There isn't a relationship between K. What do you mean? If I asked you what's the relationship between 9 and 13, you'd say, well, 9 is 4 less than 13. And that's the difference. They see numbers as being a completely arbitrary list. And that's why they count everything. That's the only way they can do it. So they don't see it as relating to descriptions of the world. And that's why it's so different. So we set out to test whether we could change this. And as well as the number beads game, we made an equivalent multiple choice game, which is where they were given this question. This group is the same as this group, plus which others of these. So that's a multiple choice version. So if you choose the 3, then yes, that's correct. And then that moves through the whole system, and 7 is 2 and what? And if you say 3 again, it'll show you 3, and it'll say, no, that's wrong, try again. So that's a very different interaction. All you know is you got it wrong. You don't know about the relationship between your answer and the correct answer. So it's a very different type of interaction with the world that we've created. So how do we account for this kind of difference in the value of the learning process that we're designing? Well, some years ago, I developed the conversational framework, as Nancy just referred to it. And the point of the framework is to be a simple summary of the main theories of teaching and learning across the last century or so. And it pulls all that together into representing the teaching learning process as basically a series of exchanges between the teacher on the one hand, the learner here, and the learner and other learners. And this way of viewing the teaching learning process describes essentially what it takes to learn. So that's what I want to use as an educator to create and test the pedagogic value of any new digital methods we're likely to use. So I want to be able to use this in the context of saying, why should one way of teaching number be different from another? Well, the framework shows how each of 6 learning types is distinctive in the way for the teacher to promote recurring cycles of concepts and skills and the relationships between them. So there's learning through acquisition, which is very most common in education, where the student is reading or watching or listening to the teacher, and that's what helps them change their concepts and their understanding. But all the other learning types are different because they involve deliberate activity by the learner. They're all types of active learning. For example, inquiry learning, the student is asking of the teacher or of a representative of the teacher something that they want to know. And they get feedback from it. And in this case, it's different because they are driving that process. They are trying to find something out. And they might be reading a book or they might be looking at a website. They're learning through inquiry. Then there's learning through practice from a specific learning environment, which sets a task, gives them some action, as in the number beads thing, and then they think about the action, they try again. Then they have to think, hang on, I'm not getting it right. What do I need to know? And they have another go. So that's a more complex cycle. So that's why learning through practice is so important. Then there's learning through discussion with a peer. And here They're active in creating questions to their peer, or their peer then asks them questions, so they've now got to create an answer, or their peer challenges them, and so they then have to think of another way of expressing it. So all the time they're articulating what they know through that process of discussion, both learner and their peer. And that's another way of getting feedback. Then there's collaboration, where you're using your practice, but you're sharing it with somebody else and seeing what their practice is. And then you can see it's different, and so you have to discuss it. So learning through collaborating is also complex and important. And finally, there's learning through production, where you have to produce something showing what you've learned to the teacher. So you're reflecting on all this and then sending something to the teacher for marking and assessment. So that's the full framework. And what we're trying to do as teachers is to keep these learning cycles within the student working all the time, constantly processing concepts, constantly doing practice with those concepts and feeding back to the concepts and the concepts informing the practice and so on. And that's how one way of representing how we learn. So when it comes to thinking about how we can use technology to help, well, let's just think about conventional methods for learning through inquiry, presentations, reading, things like that, very common. Learning through acquisition. Through inquiry, we send students to the library. Through practice, we use labs and exercises. Through discussion, we have small group discussions. Through collaboration, we have group projects. And through producing, we ask people to write essays or report or something like that. And then, but if we're wanting to use technology to support inclusion, then we have to think about the different kinds of inclusion. Now, gender is not normally thought of as a special educational need, but in some countries and cultures, women's roles are very different, and those can really affect the way they can do study. You have transgender discrimination as well, also affects acceptance. So even gender can be considered as important for inclusion. And then the different kinds of social and cultural differences. Physical disabilities are very important. Mental disabilities are very important. So in each of these cases, we have technologies that can help. For example, flexible study locations and times can help women. Safe spaces can help women or other groups who are marginalized. Social and cultural differences, countering racism, auto-translation, flexible locations, local service support with differential rates for poor technology access, even that kind of thing is important. For physical disabilities, there are many kinds of assistive technologies for interpreting sound and visuals. Mobility for travel, digital tools can help to improve user interfaces for people with reading and writing or dyspraxia difficulties. Flexible asynchronous interactions can help people who find it hard to concentrate, who can't sit in a lecture for an hour and concentrate. And more flexible online asynchronous interactions can be good for them. For mental disabilities, people with emotional needs get access to online support groups. Cognitive needs that I've already talked about give you different kinds of personalized interactions, which really help you. And I'm just going to focus on a few of these, the ones which are in bold. So when we come to the conversational framework, the point of that is to help with thinking through the learning process from the student's point of view. It's to help teachers adapt conventional learning experiences to make the best use of digital opportunities. So what do we do in the context of inclusion to support those different types? Well, thinking about the different pedagogies for learning through acquisition, for learning, reading, watching, and listening, you'll be very familiar with what they all are. For active and social learning of the kinds that I've discussed, there will be different technologies and pedagogies for each one. Assistive technology, we can use digital textbooks for students with poor eyesight, for example, because it couldn't interpret through audio. It can convert text to speech, translate text into 100 languages, change the font style, do line spacing and margin width to help people with poor eyesight, use alt text for images which are then published by the publisher along with the images. And keyboard only input to select functionality can help people in many different ways. Video animations and podcasts can be other ways in which we support people. So you can't make any sense of reading, but you can see here what this animation is showing us about how a cell splits, with chromosomes splitting into daughter cells, each with the same number of chromosomes. So you can begin to see, and you will have experienced a lot of times, ways in which different kinds of digital opportunities there are for creating things for special needs. So the media helping with learning through acquisition, there'll be many, and they change the learner's concepts, and then more presentation will change them even more using those technologies. For learning through inquiry, well, I thought, what different kinds of ways are there for representing something like the water cycle? And there are hundreds online. You can see all sorts of things, which will be extremely valuable to help people understand this process. And so the teaching one teacher might not get through, but there can be many other kinds of ways. And sending your students to learn through inquiry could bring them up with your help on that. And of course, the auto translation can translate that into any language wherever you are in the world. What about learning through inquiry? Well, this is where you're going to a site and you're getting something back from it. But how does that site actually help you with that process? And then learning through discussion, having things like online asynchronous interactions is very important for people, but also learning through discussion via shared commenting. Now, this is something that you can use within a class. And when you have a class discussion, there'll be many students who wouldn't say a word, who wouldn't ask a question, and who would leave it to the other students to do it. But with using something like Menti, you can ask every single student to post something to a Menti site. Can be anonymous, so that they can just put up their ideas, and you as a tutor can scroll through all the ideas, picking out one or two. And you will sometimes get one from somebody who would never in their life have asked the question if they had to put up their hand or do it in person. So discussion learning, many ways in which we can support students in that process of learning through discussion. And then learning through practice. Well, this is a funny example from a science subject, but this is where you create models for students to play with and see what happens as a result. And this is what I meant by constructionist learning, when you're trying to make something happen. So here you've got to try and work out what input you have to do into this system to be able to change the energy levels and the output here. And you can experiment with that and it'll show you what you've made, and you haven't got it quite right because it hasn't come out the way you want it, but you can go back and try again. So those kinds of things can be really important for learning through practice with that kind of example, or with the number beads example that I was just showing you. And it enables students to just keep going through this process of practicing and thinking, well, how can I do that better? And after a point, you've kept trying, but now I've got to start thinking about it. So you've got to think, now, what would make it work better, and how do I interpret that result? So that kind of active learning coming from something where a digital insight, a digital model gives you insight into how you should be understanding something can really help people. Then if we look at coming back to the issue of what's the difference between learning through multiple choice questions and learning through a constructionist approach, thinking about the number beads idea again. If we're looking at modeling how learning through multiple choice questions can help, in this case, the learner is learning through a learning environment. Now, I'm here using an example of a very bad form of multiple choice questions, and I'm using one that came from the BBC a long time ago. And so I think the BBC won't mind a bit of criticism. So this is typical of practically every commercial maths program you'll find for children, or indeed for any age, where you're given a question, what will the time be in 1 hour? And you're barely able to interpret that this means 11 o'clock. You might think it means 12 o'clock, so you think it should be 1 o'clock. Well, 1 o'clock isn't on offer, so you think, oh, well, four is nearest, so you click on four, and then you're just told it's wrong, and so you have to have another guess. So that is what's happening here, is that you're being asked to do something, you have a go, and it comes back and says, no, that's wrong, try again, or it might give you a hint. But you've done nothing more than that. That's all it is. You're just learning through extrinsic feedback. There's nothing for you to do here. And if we contrast that process with what it's like when you're learning through a constructionist process, very difficult. That's the same as what's happening here. This is just trying to guess which number goes with that one. And the student has nothing to tell them what to help them understand it. All they can do is just have another guess. So how does this compare with intrinsic feedback? And I'm contrasting these two, extrinsic and intrinsic. And then the example that I showed you with number beads, what that was doing was setting this goal. You've got to try and make purple fours, and you try an action. And what you've done is to make, I don't know, a yellow 5 or something. But you've realized what you've done. You need to make it a bit less than. And you see what makes of that. So you have another action, and you're going around and around that loop, and then trying to think about, well, what would make it better? And so the processing going on here is completely different from the processing going on here, where you're just guessing, really, and you get no real hint, no proper understanding of what the relationship is between the right and the wrong answer. And so comparing the two, we can see that multiple choice questions do too much for the learner. They tell the learner too many things, but the learner doesn't have to think. Whereas here, the learner's constantly trying to think, well, what should the answer be? How can I make it better? So we did a study of this. We made two versions of the number beads game. One was called number choice, and we used a standardized test with one group doing number choice and a group doing number beads. And then they had a standardized test, and there were written questions and number comparison questions before and after. And the results from these home trials, which we were doing with colleagues in Italy, where the students were sent home either with number beads or with number choice, so they were doing it in their own time. And the differences were that the group doing number beads spent 14% less total time. So they had to go through all of those stages of working with the colored beads and then the beads with digits and then right through to the digits at the end. The total success rate was much higher for number beads because they knew more about what they were trying to do. They got better feedback. And so it was a more intensive and successful engagement. And they developed greater fluency. And the success rate of 42% higher rate hits per hour was very significant. So that's the kind of thing that can make it really importantly different for students who are struggling with an idea. They're not just being tested, they're being educated. They're finding out about how numbers behave. And then in tests for the low attainers, improvement is greater for number beads than for number choice. So especially for those lower groups who were helped. But in that case, the higher attaining students were helped as well. So for low attaining students, results from pre-test to post-test show reduction in counting time, reduction in mental calculation, reductions of more than 5 seconds, up to 85 seconds after using number beads, so they got much more fluent. 7 out of 13 displayed significant improvements in mental calculation, accuracy with up to 66% more hits. Whereas for the low attaining students doing number choice, there was no improvement. And that's what's going to be happening in every classroom, where they're using those kinds of multiple choice test type of digital games, where really all they're doing is just guessing, and their performance doesn't improve. And teachers notice that. Here you can see that comparison again. For the number choice group, actually started out in the pretest being a bit better. They were faster in their counting time than the number beads group were. And at the end, they were taking more time over that task than the number beads group were. So there was a clear differentiation between the two. So maths games for people who are dyscalculic, do they support the inclusion principle? Well, the study began with the needs of very specific diversity group, people who are dyscalculic, people for whom more of the same doesn't work. So they're sitting in classrooms year after year, they're going through the same ways of teaching, the same kinds of poorly designed commercial maths games. But for that group, the constructionist game was good, and they significantly improved their performance on standard curriculum tests. But the same game was demonstrated its value also for the mainstream learners who significantly improved their performance. So this is a nice example of the challenges presented by the needs of the few, and it did lead to an innovative constructionist game, which is also of value to mainstream learners. And that new type of game, showing its value for all of these groups, is important for trying to help people in companies where they're creating these games for schools to understand they should know more about the way students learn and what really helps them. Now for the third example, online asynchronous communication for inclusivity. So there are a number of types of inclusivity, as I mentioned, and for the social and cultural differences, these are important. And sometimes you can discover some quite heartbreaking reasons why it is so important for people to be online. This was one I remember from a survey I did when I was in the Open University. One of the students said, "When I'm online, I'm not in poverty." There's an equality between students when they're just online and they're working through these flexible asynchronous interactions. Now, that's a very important part of inclusivity, making people who normally feel the difference between themselves and others when they're in a room together. Everyone's equal when you're online, and it's that a kind of asynchronous interaction. Here's another one for physical disabilities, which is assistive for sound and visuals and flexible asynchronous interactions. And here, a young woman put into her survey that online people treat me like an adult. And I thought that was a strange comment, and I looked further into her situation. And she was a woman suffering from a height disorder, which meant she was 4'6" tall. So she was child height. And even in a room where you're discussing in a tutorial group, people didn't treat her like an adult. It's different. So there are so many subtle ways in which we're not, those of us who don't have that kind of disability are just not aware of how that is affecting people around us. And with mental disabilities, they're providing access, as I was saying, access to online support groups and personalized interactions with feedback. And those things can give really people an enormous amount of support. So how do we derive some general learning design principles? Let's begin with the needs of a diversity group. The output is often of value to the many because the alternative visual audio media can be for all, and accessibility aids embedded in all apps and platforms helps everybody, just as in the case of the audio record. Maths games for dyscalculia are good for all early learners, as I showed. When we had something like number beads, it worked better even there for the real-world learning skills for all students because of that kind of constructionist design. And those students in the early maths classes, even though they weren't having a particular problem with the maths, they still progressed faster. The online asynchronous groups communications for diverse groups improve access for all, and that's where all these things work. Translation, flexible timing, alternative text, media, different kinds of media, auto-personalized interactions. For all those things, the needs of the few trigger more innovative ideas and solutions, which will be of value to everybody. And that's why we say design for the few and the many will benefit. What about deriving a general learning design methodology from this? Well, now we come to the process of creating something like a co-MOOC. And a co-MOOC is a co-designed, massive, open online course. So what we want to do here is to try to bring this kind of learning design methodology to many people in universities and schools who are making or designing learning in for their students, to remember that this should be an iterative, inclusive process, designing with the few to benefit the many. And then we move to MOOC platforms in order to scale up and reach broader collaboration. And for that process, this is our design methodology. We begin with, well, there's the 5 stages of engaging, which means we begin the design process by collaborating with representatives of the intended beneficiaries. So if we're working with, for example, one of the areas we work with is refugee groups in different countries in the world. And so we go and work with those refugee groups and the NGOs or the government officials who are supporting those people. And we work with them to find out what they need in terms of professional development or development of the refugees themselves and what kinds of things they need. And that creates the overall design for the kind of courses that we're developing. And then we develop with representatives of those groups. So we'll have a small group of 5 or 6 people drawn from this group. These would be workshops. I mean, for example, we would run workshops in Lebanon where we were working with refugees from Syria and now from elsewhere, of course, elsewhere in Lebanon. And collaborating with them and just a small selective group who are representing what we need, and that's what helps us develop the course. And then we extend that to professionals to join a MOOC platform, which reaches pretty much every country in the world. And that's what it allows us to scale up and reach and bring collaborative knowledge development across the profession. So we've started with a place like Lebanon, but now we're running that program in places like from Thailand to Colombia, all over the world. And of course, within the UK as well, and within Hong Kong. Everywhere we have people who are migrants and refugees who need to learn from each other. So although we start in one location, now we're bringing professionals together from all different kinds of locations, where most of the time we find they have a lot to share. And so the case studies that we're developing will help them a lot. But they also have some solutions of their own to contribute. And then that process embeds the activity in all these other places by using the the resources that we're creating in the course, and they can use them in their own workshops and local projects. So they don't have to have everybody online, they can actually take that into a blended learning situation. And then we sustain that process by collaborating with alumni. So people who've gone through the co-MOOC course are then invited to join us and act as mentors and help us update the co-MOOC and all the shared repositories of what's been contributed by the people taking the original round. And this is an iterative process, of course, because at each stage we're feeding back into, well, by the time we get to this stage, there's things to feed back into what we should have been doing at this stage. So it's a long iterative process. But in the context of special educational needs, we want to be able to reach all special educational needs, teachers and professionals, especially because in many cases, I mean, certainly in my experience in both universities and schools, the people who are responsible for special educational needs are isolated. There's maybe one teacher in a group in a school. Maybe we've got one small group of 3 people in our whole university who have that kind of responsibility for the whole university. They need to be in touch with others of their kind. So this kind of co-MOOC, co-designed massive open online course, which brings those people together in this way, is what we hope to achieve. So the co-design process means we have to engage with a wide range of stakeholders for long-term impact. And so this is our theory of change, to engage the professionals, might be civil servants, might be special educational needs, parents as well, charity, NGOs, and then use a small group of those to help us develop it by using video case studies of their work with children or adults, and then extend it to the platform and ask people to embed. For example, this is a case study of what people were doing within their particular community. And they can use those case studies within their own workshops and activities, and then ask people to come and work with us to create the new ones and to become sometimes mentors themselves in the later versions. So in one of these, we invited people at the end of the course. These are usually about 3-week courses. And we invited other people who'd made it all the way through to that point to come and work with us to become mentors for other people who are working through. And then they can run their own sessions in their own place using the kinds of things that we've used within the course. So we can look at each of those stages in a bit more detail for this particular opportunity. It opens up the discussion to a wide range of professionals. So I've blanked out who they are, but this is the kind of discussion that you can get going on within the MOOC platform of people sharing their knowledge from their own point of view. This is useful information. I'd love to see what's provided internationally. One gap I can see, and they're talking about gaps in local support for families and carers. Most information focuses on the child, but parents can feel stressed, tired, and overwhelmed. So they're sharing with each other what they can do to help. And of course, the people attending these courses are knowledgeable people. They're knowledgeable professionals. So getting them to share their ideas is so important. This step provides advice and guidance onto how to use the downloads and materials in the COMOOC to develop their own local blended learning professional development course. And that's how we go through that. We offer them the chance to say, how would you like to develop your knowledge? Are you interested in gaining experience? How might you do this? Share your ideas about the next steps and so on. And in this particular model has been applied within colleagues we're working with in Thailand that we know about. And their NGOs within Thailand have been able to engage over 1,000 teachers across the whole country on the same coursework by doing this exact kind of embedding the work that they've seen in a MOOC into their local teaching professional development courses. And this part, the sustained part of our theory of change is the most difficult because you've got to keep in touch with people, and when they've gone off to do something, you've got to find out what it was that they did. But it's so important, sustainability beyond the period of the project. That's what we have to try and do. And work on the sustain stage begins at the start of the whole process when we're engaging with people. We want them to be able to create ownership among the partners, and that's how we manage to keep in touch. Build the partnerships over the whole process of the course, and then those participants also become partners in the mentor model. So the alumni mentor model, for that to work, in case anyone's interested, it's a process of defining what it is. The mentor has to have been through the whole course, have a good understanding. Their comments will then be, when they come into supporting people in later runs of the course, they'll be described as a mentor. They're asked to join in the discussions when they can. They encourage participants, and then they receive a UCL certificate of participation, which is appreciation, which is a kind of, that's an incentive for them to do it. And the recruitment happens in the final week of the course, and they're judged according to whether they've completed the whole course and have made at least 10 comments, so they are natural contributors. And we check what they've said, of course. And over one course when we did it, we had 12 runs of the course, and 42 people opted to become mentors. And for every run, there were between 8 and 12 of them coming back to do more and more of this process. So we got a lot more sustained commenting. It was quite an interesting model. So I recommend it to anyone who might think about trying it. So to summarize, design for the few and benefit the many. Well, why? Well, the design for the needs of a diverse group is of value to many, and I've given some examples, and I'm sure you can think of more. And the examples show that the needs of the few trigger more innovative solutions. And those are what, as I said at the start with that quote, become a feature for everybody else, but they might also be something that no one has thought of before. It's genuinely innovative for all kinds of courses. Deriving the general design learning and principles, I think the built-in accessibility aids, the constructionist learning, digital tools for inclusion, all those things I went through are important aspects of that. And the overall learning design methodology, the co-design theory of change is to design with the few to benefit the many. So I hope that triggers some ideas for you, and I'd be very interested to hear from you what you think about that and to be challenged by you indeed. So thank you very much for listening.